Alvin Plantinga has made important contributions to philosophy of religion and is one of the most important Christian philosophers of all time. One of his most important contributions is his modal ontological argument. If someone asked you to explain his modal ontological argument, could you do it? So in this video, I'm going to share with you some of the important points that will help you to unlock a deeper understanding of it and really work through it with you, including drawing a few things up on the board to sort of visualize it so that if you actually have to discuss it with someone, you're able to do so with confidence. Welcome to the Examined Faith. Atheist philosopher William Rowe said the following about Plantinga's argument, quote, "There is no presentation of the ontological argument that is as carefully developed, forceful, and clear as Plantinga's formulation and discussion of the argument on pages blah 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 in The Nature of Necessity," a classic, and his defense of the modal version of the argument on other pages. So William Rowe was very impressed by Plantinga's defense of his argument in that. And then in God, Freedom, and Evil, Plantinga also discusses his modal ontological argument right at the very end. So if you have this, you can go ahead and get it out and go right to the very end. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually discuss a version of that argument that connects all the dots, and it is in this excellent book. The first premise runs as follows, quote, "There is a possible world in which maximal greatness is instantiated. 2, necessarily, a being is maximally great only if it has maximal excellence in every world. 3, necessarily, a being has maximal excellence in every world only if it has the omni characteristics, omniscience, omnipotence, and moral perfection in every world." Now, what Plantinga is doing is he's avoiding committing himself to saying that God is possible from the start, a possible being that doesn't actually exist in the actual world. The version of the modal ontological argument he was considering before he goes into his version, his triumphant version, as he calls it, is one that assumed that there are possible but not actual, that is non-existent, entities, like, for instance, unicorns, right? Unicorns exist, at least they're possible, and they exist perhaps in some possible world, but they don't exist in the actual world, and therefore they don't in fact exist. Now, to avoid committing to that sort of idea, now you might say, well, why avoid committing to that? Well, think about it. If there can be possible beings that don't actually exist, then, right from the start, you're asking people to take on a pretty heavyweight metaphysical assumption. That is, he talks about different mountains. So imagine you have Mount Whitney, which is a particular mountain, the same sort of exact mountain, but somehow it's put in a different place, put right next to in the Grand Tetons. So Mount Whitney is sort of not relocated. There's just another possible, right? It's just possible. There's another possible Mount Whitney in the Grand Tetons, right? It's possible, but it doesn't actually, in fact, exist. Well, you can imagine you're bloating your metaphysics, your ontology right from the start. There's going to be all sorts of possible... I just realized I'm talking over my glasses. Yeah, I have reading glasses. Anyway, there's going to be all these possible entities all over the place. And he thought, well, hey, if we go that route, people are going to just balk right at the start. So let's not assume there's a possible being that doesn't exist in the actual world. Let's just say there's this property. What's the property? Well, it is that there is a possible world somewhere where maximal greatness is instantiated. Maximal greatness is just a property, and maximal greatness is basically possessing all the perfections, all the great-making properties, and those properties are properties that are intrinsically good to have, and they're maxed out to their maximal degree. They're going to end up being the omni properties, right? So that's why in 2 we get necessarily a being is maximally great only if it has maximal excellence in every world. So let's drop some worlds, to just kind of help get this going here. Let's kick this off. Draw a bunch of circles, right? Here's all our possible worlds. Look, I'm drawing, not even looking. There we go. A bunch of possible worlds there. Okay, so there is a possible world. There's a possible world somewhere where maximal greatness is instantiated necessarily. So there you've got a necessity operator. This proposition can't fail to be true, fail to be false. This proposition can't be false. It's not possible that it's false. Therefore, it's necessary. Necessarily, a being is maximally great only if it has maximal excellence in every world. So if there is a being, not saying that there is a being, right? But if there is a being, then it will be maximally great only if in every single possible world, it's going to have maximal excellence, right? Otherwise, it won't be a maximally great being. Why? In one of the possible worlds, it would lack a great-making property, and that would, by definition, mean it wasn't maximally great. There was something lacking that it could have had, namely in almost all possible worlds, but in not all possible worlds, it had the great-making properties. Now, 3, necessarily, a being has maximal excellence in every world only if, and here we get the description of what that means, only if it has omniscience, omnipotence, and moral perfection in every world. So necessarily a being's going to have that maximal excellence, that property in every world, if and only if you go to a world, right? We're scanning our worlds, our possibilities, and in this world, if we find that being, then that being will have all the perfections. That is, it'll have all the omni properties. So anywhere we go, it'll have that. Now, if 1 is true, remember 1, there is a possible world in which maximal greatness is instantiated. If that's true, I'm still doing the over the eye thing. I don't know. Oh well. This is just what happens when you get a little bit older. If 1 is true, then there is a possible world W. We'll just stick a W here on one of these bad boys, in which if it had been actual, right? So if this possible world, remember the actual world is a possible world. So if this world had been actual, we can say, just put a little subscript there. So A, we'll just say A. If it had been actual, there would have existed an omniscient, omnipotent, morally perfect being which had those qualities in every possible world. So remember, we are scanning all the possibilities, and we say any world we go to, if a being has maximal excellence, is maximally great, it's going to have maximal excellence in every world. Then when we go to a particular world, that being would have, not saying that it exists, but that being would have all the omni perfections. So then we just sort of pick a world. We say, here's a world, W. We don't even have to call it the actual world, W. And if it were the actual, this is a counterfactual, right? We're not assuming this thing exists. It's if it had been actual, there would have been, it's a subjunctive conditional, there would have existed an omniscient, omnipotent, morally perfect being which had these qualities in every possible world. So that is, if there's a possible world in which maximal greatness, this property of maximal greatness is instantiated, then if we go to a possible world, and if it had been the actual world, because remember, actual world is a possible world, then there would have existed an omni-God or an omni-being which had those qualities in every possible world. So we'd find that being in this world having all the omni qualities, and that being would likewise have all the omni properties in all possible worlds. Okay, then we get 5. If the non-existence of an omni-God or omni-being is impossible in at least one possible world, then it is impossible in every possible world, since what is possible does not vary from one world to another. So if we go to a world, we'll just stick with W. If we go to W and the non-existence of that omni-being is impossible in that world, which is a possible world, because remember that omni-being has to exist in all possible worlds, so it's not possible that that omni-God does not exist in world W. So then it is impossible in every possible world. So it's impossible that that God, that being with the omni properties, does not exist in all possible worlds. Okay? Now we get the conclusion, therefore, 6, the non-existence of an omni being is impossible in our actual world and in every possible world, right? So now we just sort of, instead of just focusing on one world, we've sort of generalized and said, look, the non-existence of such a being is impossible in our actual world, okay? Whatever world that is, could be W, because the actual world is a possible world, and that being will have the perfections in every possible world, and therefore the non-existence of that being is impossible in all possible worlds. Therefore what? If it's impossible that that being doesn't exist in all possible worlds, then that means it's necessary that that being does exist in all possible worlds. Remember, necessity is, if it's necessary that P, then that's also saying that it's not possible that not P. So if it's not possible that God does not exist, then it's necessary that God does exist. And what we mean necessary that God exists is that God exists in all possible worlds, right? So that is the upshot. And as Elizabeth Burns says, the upshot, or what this amounts to, is, quote, it is possible there is a being with maximal greatness, that is, one which has maximal excellence in every possible world. And then 2, since our world is a possible world, it must contain a being with maximal greatness. So, what kind of does this end up turning on? Well, an important thing that Plantinga points out in God, Freedom, and Evil is that ultimately this will come down to, the soundness of the argument will come down to premise 1, whether you think it's possible that this property of maximal greatness is instantiated in some possible world. Now, what do you think? Do you think it is possible? Plantinga thinks it's rational to believe that, and therefore, even if you think the first premise is false because you don't endorse that, at least you can see that a rational person will endorse that. And it makes sense to say, hey, it's possible in some possible world that the property of maximal greatness is instantiated. Or do you think, no, that's incoherent. That doesn't even make sense to say that the property of maximal greatness is possibly instantiated. What do you think? Do you think the argument works? I'd love to hear from you. Go ahead and leave it in the comments. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so that you can get more philosophy and theology to strengthen your mind and faith.